Segue into the questions, and we'll just get into my beef with historians in a more natural way. From the Mississippi Delta, who works for Rupert Murdoch at the most conservative newspaper in America, write this book. And I'll give you the condensed version. Of course, why one really doesn't know why one does anything, but part of the answer to that is that I was born in the fall of 1964, a few months after Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is not all that far from where I grew up in Mississippi. In 1965, in the spring of 1965, there was a farm labor strike on a plantation just outside the town where I lived most of my childhood. That was the first farm labor action of any kind, much less by African Americans, that had occurred anywhere in the South since the Depression. And it was supposed to have been part of a very large strike organized by mostly the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1965, where farm workers all across the Delta were supposed to walk off the job. But in an era before cell phones and instant communication, things broke down, and only one group of strikers actually pulled the trigger that morning. And so this group of about 80 men and women and their children left this one plantation. And of course, they were evicted from their homes, and they were harassed by the Ku Klux Klan and all variety of other folk. None of the men in that group ever worked again in that county. There's still one or two of them alive. The leader of that group just died a few months ago. They ended up building a little settlement on a piece of land that was purchased by a white philanthropist in the north, a place that came to be called Strike City, and lived the rest of their lives there in fairly desperate poverty after the strike in 1965. For a few days around Christmas of 1965, or right after the strike occurred in the spring, and again around Christmas that year, that incident was sort of the civil rights incident of the week, and got national attention for a very brief period of time, and then history moved on, and they were largely forgotten. And then in 1968, a group of black high school students staged a march, a silent march across our little town from the black high school to the white high school. And the schools there were still almost entirely segregated in 1968. And as they approached the white high school, the police chief of the town began firing tear gas at this group of black students. And a melee ensued after that, and there were people running through the town. The windows were being broken and fights breaking out. And in the course of this day-long affray, a 16-year-old African-American boy burst through the front door of a feed and seed store on the edge of town, and the white man behind the counter pulled out a pistol and shot him in the doorway. The boy survived, but the white man was never charged with anything. It was never investigated. In 1969, October of 69, the U.S. Supreme Court issued an order that is somewhat forgotten now, but was pivotal in the South, because the Supreme Court ordered that 30 school districts in Mississippi, including mine, immediately cease all resistance to desegregation after 15 years of passively trying to claim to be complying with the Brown decision of '54. The Supreme Court finally said, close your doors at Christmas as segregated schools and reopen fully integrated in every grade. And so that happened in my town. And in the fall of 1970, I began the first grade. And so I was in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade, black and white together, and go through 12 grades of public education together. And for reasons that are more complicated than we have time for, in my town, though this is sort of the subject of my next book, but in my town, there was a group of more moderate white Southerners who banded together, not so much out of a sense of racial justice, but out of a kind of conservative ideal of the importance of public schools to the classic American community. But a group of more moderate whites set out to try to keep whites in the public school system. And my family was one of those. And so as a result of that, unlike all the other towns in that part of Mississippi, which is a majority black section of Mississippi. So I lived in a majority black town and a majority black county and in an overwhelmingly black area of Mississippi. In every other town at that time, all whites left the public school system immediately. There were virtually no whites anywhere left in public schools instantly. But in our town, and one or two other places, there was this small constituency of whites. And so I attended these schools that were 75% black, 25% white, and none of that I've just described was I aware of at the time, obviously. And all of that I figured out later, many years later. And I had no idea that my parents had been a part of the civil rights movement and all of that until I was an adult. But I did know, even as a child, that something was profoundly wrong. Something crazy was happening, and I couldn't understand it. All the black kids were mad at me for some reason that I could not put my finger on, at any time. And so I was kind of mad at all the black kids because they were all mad at me, and though I didn't know exactly why. Everybody was throwing around this word prejudice, which, that was the word then. You didn't say racist as much. Now we say racist, but in those days it was prejudice. And everyone was throwing around the word prejudice, but as a first grader, I really didn't know what the word meant. I just knew it was this bad thing. And if somebody said you were prejudiced, that was a bad thing. And that there were a lot of my friends who were prejudiced, and whose parents were prejudiced. And almost everybody in my family, except my parents, was really prejudiced. And I knew that was bad, but I didn't understand it. And then the other strange thing of going to these overwhelmingly black schools in this sort of tense environment, but still the rest of my life being archly segregated. I played on an all-white baseball team, an all-white Boy Scout troop, went to an all-white church. All the other aspects of life remained institutionally segregated for many years. And so the strange life of moving between those things, trying to understand why all that was happening, was very confusing to me. For whatever reason, I kind of obsessed on it, and began to ask a lot of questions about why things were the way they were. Those were usually unwelcome questions at that time, but I began to ask, and then finally, when I was in the 7th grade, for reasons I don't remember anymore, there was an essay contest sponsored by the County Historical Society, and any student from any school in the county could submit an essay on any topic related to the history of the county. And it was the sesquicentennial, I believe, of the county. And so I chose as my topic, for reasons I don't recall, that strike that had occurred in 1965. And I think because the only way that I could have even known about that was that, because that is not something white people would have discussed. Even people who considered themselves the most progressive or the most liberal at the time would have never said anything about that incident. But there were children at my school who were the children of Strike City strikers. And there were at least 1 or 2 girls in my class who lived at Strike City. And so that must be the way that I came to know that the place existed. But so I wrote this little simple 12-year-old's essay in 1977, or whatever it would have been, about the Strike City incident, and submitted that to the contest. And a few weeks later, a letter arrived with my name typed on the outside, unusual event in those days, and opened it up, and I had won 2nd place in the contest. And I was to appear at the county fair on an appointed day at an appointed place, and Mrs. Baker would be there in a blue dress, and I was to go there and find her for the awards ceremony. And so my mother dropped me off at the county fair, something we would not do today with an 11 or 12-year-old. And I went to the designated location, and there was a middle-aged white lady in a blue dress, who obviously was Mrs. Baker. But I was too timid to walk up and introduce myself, and I was certain she would recognize me. Sometimes there was no hint of recognition, and she was still scanning the crowd. And finally, another little white boy came along, who I knew through church circles, but who attended one of the segregationist academies that had popped up overnight, which is where almost all of the white kids had gone. So this other kid comes along, and she recognizes him, knows who he is, and they start talking, and the contest is mentioned, and I realize, okay, that's the lady. And I walk up, and I introduce myself as Doug Blackmon. And when I do that, I don't know if I realized it at that moment, or it was later, or sort of lost that. But based on the expression in her eyes, it's clear to me now that the combination of the topic of my essay, the fact that I went to an overwhelmingly black school, the oddity of my last name, that I was supposed to have been the colored boy getting a certificate that day. And so I've always considered myself an early beneficiary of affirmative action.